It looked like a torch or something found in a bedside drawer. Anyone who saw it would assume it was some kind of tool, maybe something an electrician carried. They certainly wouldn't assume that it was one of the deadliest weapons of the Second World War. Inside that innocent cylinder was a lead-weighted cosh capable of crushing a skull. A 24-inch piano wire that could strangle a man in seconds, and a spring-loaded stiletto blade that deployed with a single shake of the wrist. 3 ways to kill hidden inside one device. Collector records suggest only about 24 were ever made, but the story is much deeper than meets the eye. This is the story of the McLaglen-Pescott close combat weapon, one of SOE's most unusual combination close combat tools of the Second World War. By 1941, Britain was fighting a war it had never planned to fight. The army that had crossed the Channel in 1939 had been forced back in chaos less than a year later. Much of its heavy equipment lay rusting on the beaches of Dunkirk. Across Europe, German occupation stretched from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean. Railways, bridges, power stations, fuel depots, all now worked for the enemy. Britain could not retake that territory by force, not yet. What it could do was interfere with it. That task fell to a new organisation working quietly out of London. The Special Operations Executive was created to do what conventional armies could not: infiltrate occupied countries, organise resistance, sabotage infrastructure, and undermine German control from within. Its agents would travel light, operate alone or in small groups, and disappear just as quickly as they arrived. But sabotage created a problem that was far more intimate than explosives or radio transmitters. Every railway line had guards, every depot had sentries, every factory had night watchmen, and every one of those men represented a potential alarm. A single shout, a single rifle shot, a single struggle lasting a few seconds too long, and an entire operation could collapse. Firearms were unreliable answers. Even suppressed pistols produced sound that carried in still night air. Knives demanded close contact and perfect timing. Garrots required positioning, strength, and nerves of steel. Each method worked, but only under the right conditions. And conditions behind enemy lines were rarely ideal. SOE operatives were trained to improvise, but improvisation had limits. Fumbling for the right weapon in the dark under stress, with gloves numb from cold, was not a theoretical concern. It was the difference between success and capture, between escape and interrogation, between survival and a shallow grave. The problem was not how to kill. Britain already knew how to do that. The problem was how to give one man operating alone the certainty that whatever situation he found himself in, from a silent approach to a sudden confrontation, he would not be caught unprepared. Solving that problem would push British wartime ingenuity into far stranger territory than most people ever imagine. It began, as many of Britain's stranger wartime ideas did, in offices and workshops far removed from gunfire, places where the war was fought with sketches, prototypes, and uncomfortable questions. By late 1940 and into 1941, SOE was still defining what it actually needed. Training schools were experimenting, field reports were filtering back, lessons were being learned the hard way. What became clear was that standardization had limits. Issuing a knife, a wire, and a cosh as separate items made sense on paper. In practice, it assumed calm, preparation, and time. 3 things an agent rarely possessed when operating illegally in occupied territory. Engineers and planners began to ask whether the problem could be approached differently, not with a better knife or a better garrote, but with consolidation. That line of thinking was very much of its moment. Wartime Britain was under pressure to simplify, to economize, and to make every ounce carried by an operative justify its existence. Radios were miniaturized, explosives were disguised as everyday objects, weapons were hidden inside sleeves, shoes, even clothing fasteners. Combining functions was not seen as excess, it was seen as efficiency. Somewhere within that environment, the idea emerged of a single close combat tool that could adapt instantly to circumstance. If striking was required, it would strike. If silence was paramount, it would strangle. If steel was the only answer, it would provide it. One object, always to hand, eliminating the need to choose. The development appears to have involved an unusual pairing. On one side were skilled craftsmen capable of precision metalwork, operating within Britain's traditional gun-making world, an industry already deeply entangled with wartime contracts. On the other was a man deeply invested in theories of hand-to-hand combat, who believed that close fighting could be systematized, taught, and engineered into tools as much as techniques. Records suggest that early prototypes were produced quietly, without fanfare. This was not a mass-issue project. It did not move through the same channels as standard infantry weapons. Instead, it occupied the grey area that so many SOE devices did, somewhere between experiment and solution, tested by a handful of people who understood exactly what it was for. There were constraints from the beginning. Materials were limited. Manufacturing time was precious. Above all, secrecy mattered. Anything developed for clandestine work had to remain obscure, unremarked upon, and easily forgotten if abandoned. Failure would not be announced. Success would never be advertised. By 1942, the concept had solidified enough to warrant formal protection. A British patent was filed, written in careful, almost clinical language, describing improvements in close combat weapons. On paper, it read like a piece of abstract engineering. In reality, it represented an attempt to solve one of the most personal problems of the secret war. But a concept on paper is not a weapon in the dark. The real question still lay ahead: whether this idea, born of necessity and theory, could function when stripped of diagrams and placed in a human hand, under pressure, with no second chance. The device that emerged from this line of thinking was never given a dramatic name. Officially, it was simply a close combat weapon. Internally, it became associated with the two men whose ideas shaped it, a pairing of practical manufacturing skill and unorthodox fighting theory. Together, their names would later be attached to one of the strangest tools ever conceived for Britain's clandestine war. The Maclaglen Pesket close combat weapon was designed with a single principle in mind: certainty. Not superiority, not elegance, certainty. Whatever situation an operative found himself in, the tool on his wrist would offer an immediate answer without hesitation or choice. It was not intended to replace firearms, nor to turn agents into assassins roaming the streets at will. Its role was far narrower and far darker. This was a weapon for moments when an operation had already gone wrong, when a sentry stood where he was not expected, when timing collapsed, or when silence mattered more than speed. In concept, it was brutally straightforward. 3 methods of killing, unified into one concealed object, carried on the body rather than in a pocket or belt. No reaching, no drawing, no searching in the dark. The response was always already there. What made it unusual was not the individual components, all were well known, but the decision to bind them together. It represented a belief that the chaos of close combat could be engineered away, that by removing choice, by removing delay, survival could be improved. Only a very small number were ever produced. They were never issued widely. They were never publicized. And if they were tested, it was done quietly, without ceremony or celebration. Yet their existence alone says something important about the moment in which they were created. By the middle of the war, Britain was no longer just fighting with armies and aircraft. It was fighting with ideas, some conventional, others deeply uncomfortable, all driven by the same question: what would it take to survive long enough to win? And to answer that, the engineers had to look not at battlefields, but at the human hand, the human wrist, and the fraction of a second in which everything could be lost. That, ultimately, is what this weapon was built for, and why its true test would not be in theory but in reality. What makes the Maclaglen Pesket weapon unusual is not how complex it was, but what it attempted to solve through design rather than training. By the time it reached its final form, British engineers already understood close-quarters killing extremely well. Police forces, commandos, and covert units had spent years refining individual methods: striking, stabbing, strangling. None of these were experimental. What was experimental was the belief that the chaos of those moments could be reduced through mechanical certainty. The weapon's construction reflected that mindset. It was built to be worn, not carried. That distinction mattered. A tool worn on the body does not need to be found. It does not get dropped. It does not require a decision to reach for it. In theory, the hand simply moves and the action follows. Everything about the device prioritized immediacy. There were no delicate adjustments, no complex sequences. Each function relied on gravity, leverage, or direct physical force, principles that do not fail easily under stress. The designers clearly assumed use in darkness, bad weather, and moments of physical exhaustion. Fine motor skills were not something they trusted. Just as importantly, the weapon was designed to look unremarkable. Britain's clandestine engineers understood that concealment was psychological as much as physical. A pistol, even hidden, announces intent. A knife suggests violence. A plain metal object suggests nothing at all. If discovered during a casual search, it might invite questions, but not immediate conclusions. Yet this drive to combine functions introduced unavoidable compromises. No single component could be as effective as a dedicated tool. A purpose-built cosh could be heavier. A standalone blade could be longer and more robust. A separate garrote could offer better grip and control. The McLaglen pesket accepted those trade-offs in exchange for speed and certainty. It also assumed something else, that the operative would trust it completely. There would be no time to second-guess whether this was the right answer. The design asked its user to commit fully, without hesitation, in the most intimate form of combat imaginable. This was not engineering in pursuit of elegance or mass production. It was engineering in pursuit of a moment, a second or two in which failure was fatal. On paper, the solution made sense. In theory, it was ruthless efficiency. What remained unanswered was whether theory could survive reality, whether a device designed to eliminate choice would actually reduce risk, or simply introduce new ones when tested beyond the workshop. That question could only be answered away from diagrams and patents in the conditions it was built for, and those conditions were never forgiving. There is another reason this device has always unsettled people, even before they understand what it was meant to do. At rest, stripped of context, it looks wrong in a way that is difficult to place. Not overtly threatening, not obviously military, smooth, cylindrical, purposefully plain. It resembles something domestic, even intimate, the sort of object that might be dismissed with an embarrassed cough and averted eyes rather than suspicion. That resemblance was not accidental. British clandestine design during the war often relied on misdirection through normality. The safest weapon was not the one that looked fearsome, but the one that looked like nothing at all, something that could sit on a table, in a drawer or under a sleeve, and invite assumptions rather than questions. Innuendo, it turns out, can be a form of camouflage. If discovered, this device did not immediately announce itself as a weapon. It suggested embarrassment, not danger, curiosity, not alarm. In occupied territory, that distinction mattered. A pistol was proof. A knife was evidence. A strange, ambiguous object might buy a few seconds, and in this world, seconds were currency. Yet that very ambiguity is what makes the weapon feel so unsettling today. It sits uncomfortably between worlds, part tool, part weapon, part something else entirely. It does not conform to the visual language of war. There are no edges that warn you, no shape that signals intent, and perhaps that is the most revealing thing about it. This was not a device born of battlefield necessity, but of clandestine paranoia, a weapon designed for pockets, sleeves, and private spaces rather than parade grounds. It reflects a war fought in shadows where appearances were manipulated as carefully as mechanics, which raises an uncomfortable question. If the weapon was so carefully disguised, so deliberately ambiguous, so specialized in purpose, what happened when it finally encountered the realities of the war it was built for? That answer lies not in theory or appearance, but in outcomes. When the McLaglen pesket weapon is examined in the context of the wider war, a striking pattern emerges. Not of failure, but of quiet disappearance. There is no clear evidence that it was ever used in a confirmed operation. No after-action reports credit it with success. No memoir lingers on it with pride or bitterness. Unlike other SOE tools, it leaves almost no footprint in the historical record of the field itself, and that absence is revealing. By the time the weapon existed in finished form, the nature of Britain's secret war had already begun to stabilize. Agents were no longer being equipped experimentally, but selectively. Tools that proved reliable were kept. Tools that demanded explanation were quietly set aside. In that environment, familiarity mattered, trust mattered, and simplicity mattered more than ingenuity. Operatives already had answers they believed in. The Fairbairn Sykes knife was brutal, simple, and proven. Dedicated garrots were crude but effective. Suppressed pistols, particularly later in the war, offered something the McLaglen Pesket could not: distance. Each of these required fewer assumptions, fewer moving parts, and less explanation under pressure. The McLaglen Pesket, by contrast, asked too much of its user. It asked them to trust a compromise, that 3 partially optimized solutions were better than 1 perfected one. It also carried a psychological weight. If discovered, it did not look like standard military equipment. It looked deliberate, personal, designed. In occupied Europe, that distinction was dangerous. Timing also worked against it. By 1942 and 1943, SOE doctrine had matured. Training emphasized standardization, muscle memory, and repetition. Introducing an unfamiliar, highly specialized object into that system created friction rather than advantage. Even a brilliant idea can fail if it arrives after habits have already formed. As a result, the weapon seems to have drifted into obscurity almost as soon as it appeared. A handful were produced, a few were tested, most were stored, forgotten, or quietly discarded as the war moved on without them. And yet, that does not make it meaningless. The McLaglen Pesket represents a particular moment in Britain's wartime mindset, a moment when the country was still willing to explore every possible solution, no matter how strange, no matter how uncomfortable. It belongs to the same family as other experimental devices that were conceived quickly, judged harshly, and abandoned without sentiment. Its legacy is not one of battlefield impact, but of intent. Today, surviving examples sit behind glass or circulate quietly among collectors, divorced from the fear and urgency that created them. They are often discussed as curiosities, oddities of design, sometimes even joked about. But that modern distance obscures the reality of why such a thing was imagined at all. This was a weapon born not of excess, but of anxiety. Of a nation unsure how long it could survive, willing to compress every possible advantage into the smallest possible space. And in that sense, even unused, it fulfilled its purpose, as evidence of how far Britain was prepared to go when silence mattered more than anything else. Which brings us back to where this story began. At the beginning, it looked like nothing at all. A short cylinder of dark metal, something that could be mistaken for a torch or a tool, or something private enough that most people would prefer not to look too closely. In wartime, objects like that passed through hands and rooms without comment. That was the disguise. What made the McLaglen Pesket unsettling was never just what it contained, but how completely it rejected the visual language of war. It did not announce violence. It did not resemble a weapon meant to be seen, issued, or celebrated. It was designed to exist quietly, to be misunderstood, and if necessary, to be forgotten. In the end, that may explain its fate better than any technical shortcoming. The war moved on, better tools emerged, simpler answers prevailed, and this one, too strange, too specific, too intimate, slipped sideways out of history, not because it failed catastrophically, but because it asked questions Britain no longer needed to answer. Today, when it reappears in museums or collections, it provokes curiosity, discomfort, and the occasional nervous joke. Those reactions say more about distance than design. We are no longer living in a moment where such objects feel necessary, but in 1941 they did. The McLaglen Pesket remains a reminder of a brief, uneasy chapter in Britain's secret war, when ingenuity met fear, when appearances were engineered as carefully as mechanisms, and when even the most unassuming object could be asked to carry the weight of survival. 7 inches of dark metal, 3 silent possibilities, and a war that demanded answers no one wanted to give.